Hi everyone. This lecture is about incorporating feedback and co-creation with your users. So we've gone through our design thinking process now step by step. We know that the ideal model really ends at the test stage, but for our purposes, I've added another step, which is impact evaluation. So after you've really done your test, you want to step back and evaluate the impact that you had, even if it's on a small number of users or in a small customer co-creation setting. One of the things that's really important to remember is that every step of the design thinking process can be a learning loop, meaning that you may take what you learn in the following step and feel like you have to step back and go back to an earlier stage. So you might find that after you've looked at the test, you might want to go back and redefine the problem differently, or you might want to ideate and get new information. You may want to try a different kind of prototype or modify your prototype. You might even decide that you want to run different tests, or you may even go all the way back and discover that there's someone else in the picture that you should be having empathy for. All of these steps are healthy. It's part of the process. I know that sometimes when you're on a time-bound program like this DSW degree, it can feel a little scary to have to go back a step and revisit, but it's important to hang on to the fact that you'll be better at you'll know a lot more, and you'll be a lot faster in each iteration. And that overall, these repetitive, iterative processes ultimately actually help us produce a much better project in an overall shorter time frame. So this is really how we create the most effective and impactful project possible. So what do you do to debrief after a co-creation session? And ideally this is with your team, but you may, if you're leading a project on your own, simply want to step back and journal or write for yourself and step back and think about what really happened. So first you want to start with just thinking about what was the stimulus. What did you show them to gauge your interest, and how did they respond? You want to observe what they did and said. You want to see what feelings came up. You want to see if any new or underlying needs may be indicated by those emotions or by their interaction with the prototype. And then above all, you want to think about what are the implications. So what does this mean for you and your project? This is really the most important step. It's really worth, stepping back. If you haven't slept a lot in preparation for that co-creation session, getting a night of sleep, trying to not, sit in a place from stress, but really sit at a place from calm thoughtfulness about how did the session go? What did you learn? And what are the implications, good, bad, or indifferent for your project? So you might find that you get certain kinds of output from this kind of co-creation session, or from the inquiry, as I call it. You might identify new needs. You might identify new problems, or find that you want to define the problem in a different way. You might also find implementation considerations. So you might learn things that help you assess or understand just how feasible your idea is. You might decide that you really want to go back and revise the design, and in particular, you may identify new features that should be built into your solution. You might also get a sense that after you've seen users work with your solution, you might find that you have different sets of priorities. That maybe some parts turned out to be more important than you thought. You might want to prioritize the development of those. Others may be less important. So you might find that you're shuffling your development plan or even your implementation plan a little bit. You might also find that you have new unanswered questions, maybe from the user, maybe from your work, that you have to go back and ideate around. You may also find that you get further insight into the assumptions that you made, and either have to make new assumptions or want to revisit those assumptions, and you might ultimately decide that there are new tests that you need. As we mentioned, design thinking really is an iterative process, so it's important to hang on to all this learning, and maybe even going back to earlier stages of the design cycle will actually help you build a much more effective, much more efficient project in the long run. So all of these learnings are tremendously valuable and useful to you in your work. So after you've done the co-creation session, you might find that there's some new next steps that you want to think about. One is brainstorming solutions to the parts that failed. So obviously you want to look at what didn't work and figure out how to fix it, and that might be its own design process or inquiry. Again, if you're working on a solo project, this might be a time to go back to your kitchen cabinet or to your, your colleagues in the program, a professor, and just chat about what didn't work and what you learned, and see what comes up as a new path. This may be a spot that you're stuck with initially because you might be a little surprised or shocked, or something unexpected might have happened, and that's okay. Give yourself some time to percolate and just think about it. Sometimes it's even okay to put it on the back burner and then come back to it later when you've had a little bit of time to step back. You want to revise your concepts in napkin pitch if needed. So think about how you're presenting your idea and if any changes from the tests, have implications for that. You'll want to refine key assumptions. Ultimately, one of the steps is going to be to create a higher fidelity prototype. So you're going to want to go to the next development stage in your cycle, and that might mean thinking about what does a new technology product or a new pilot test look like. You might want to plan for your overall rollout. All of that can come into the process at this point. You want to develop new ways to engage your customers and stakeholders in co-creation potentially. So you might find that you want to go back to certain customers, talk with people that maybe weren't part of the discussion for whatever reason, and make sure that you're incorporating all of those point of views. Oftentimes, people whose thoughts we hadn't engaged sometimes pop up at this stage. So don't be surprised if you find you have to go back and do a little bit more interviewing or ideation work at this stage. You want to explore, again, unanswered questions that might have popped up and really think about how all of this helps you better plan for your implementation process. So, of course, this co-creation process, this, running design labs, all of this can be tremendously useful. So don't be afraid to leverage this to help build a better product. So a couple little tips here, just, to think about how to get the best outcomes possible, when you're doing this processing feedback step. First is, it's okay to use your intuition here. We are designers. We're kind of the captains of these ships, and it's up to us to really decide what direction in which to take our project. Now, obviously, your professors will guide you towards using information, best practices, all of that stuff. But at a certain point, if your intuition is really, saying loud and clear that there's a certain direction that you should be going in, don't necessarily, ignore that or go in the opposite direction. At the same time, you want to make sure you're not discounting what people tell you, especially if you've heard from the same piece of feedback from a lot of people. And this can be super hard. So one quick example on this, I worked on a prize called the Global Learning X Prize, and we heard from all of our experts that for cognitive development reasons, we really wanted to make sure that we taught literacy in 2 phases. We wanted to make sure for a prize that we were using native language first and then potentially teaching them English second. Our leadership at X Prize didn't want to do that. They really felt that the global nature of the English language was essential and felt that we should go straight to that process. But ultimately, we heard from a lot of experts and just changed the prize design because so many people told us that they felt that this, the native language was the way to go. So sometimes your experts will tell you super important stuff and you should heed it. But at the other time, you want to make sure that if you have an instinct or a totally novel idea, people may not be able to reflect that back to you. So that's okay. One of the things that's really interesting about these kinds of labs or this kind of customer co-creation or even the interview process is that we're not exactly required to evaluate this the same way as we might evaluate research. It's not performed the same way. It's really more in that market research category. It's really more in gathering useful thoughts and opinions. So if you have someone that you think is really anchored, really smart, gets what you're talking about, or a user that just really stood out to you in terms of the feedback that they gave you, you can weight that more heavily. You don't have to necessarily say all input is of equal value. And this is, again, that part of where you get to use your intuition in this process. And again, I mentioned this already once, but I just think it's important to hit it. Don't necessarily rush to process implications or immediately, same day walk away with a redesign. Of course, if you have a big aha, jot it down, take some time to think about it. But sometimes the best ideas and best ways to respond actually come later after we've had a little time to process everything together. So give yourself the time to thoughtfully redesign based on what you learned from the co-creation process. So that's it. That's incorporating feedback. Definitely see your professors if you have any questions. Thanks.